Thank you so much. Thanks everybody for being here. I'm so excited to be here, and I again just want to continue the massive appreciation for the organizers of Final Girl, and Sarah and Ellie and Lara and Mine and everybody else, and it's been awesome so far. I'm going home with so many ideas and things that I want to watch, so thank you. It's been great. Afterwards, if anyone has any questions about the Montreal Monstrum Society, which is kind of an open access public horror school in Montreal, please feel free to come and chat with me. So today I want to talk about biotechnological reproductive horror from a feminist perspective. And I think there's a lot of sympathetic connections between my talk and Allison's, for those of you guys who were here earlier, some common touchstones. And biotechnological horror, the way that I've been thinking about it is as a kind of hybrid form of horror. Not sure why this is so. Can you hear me like this? Okay. A hybrid form of horror between sort of horror and sci-fi. If you could go to the next slide, please. So this relationship between horror and science fiction is often classically understood through the lens of reproductive technology. So I think the touchstone here is always Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which automatically gives it a kind of feminist edge. And I want to think broadly around this question of what counts as a reproductive technology, how media can also be understood as a kind of reproductive technology, particularly in the contemporary moment, in dialogue, and put it in dialogue with contemporary biotechnological facts and also fictions and reproductions from feminist, queer, and trans theory. And my main question is around the meaning of reproductive biotechnology in horror, read through a feminist lens, is always the question of what is horrifying and why. So rather than thinking of it as kind of an ontological thing where things are sort of ontologically or essentially horrifying, I want to think about like what the work of horror does, particularly for horror audiences. So in other words, like what's the potential of horror? Horror acts on the body. So Linda Williams, film theorist, has a notion of what she calls body genres, and she said body genre cinemas are cinemas that do things to body. So like porn makes you come, comedy makes you laugh, horror makes you scream. They act directly on the body. Science fiction, we often think supposedly acts on the mind, right? It's speculative. But biotechnological horror really kind of confounds this. Sci-fi is speculative in orientation. Horror is often about the immediacy of sensation in the body, but I would argue that a feminist approach doesn't want to work on this kind of distinction or this kind of binary split between mind and body. In fact, it's often working very much against that binary split. So sensation, I want to argue, in horror film is speculative. It's always productive. It generates new possibilities and new potentials. And that's, I think, what's really interesting about it. And I think this is why body genre films, like biotechnological horror, are often sites of kind of plastic desire. So kind of beyond just the question of like straight representation, like what do they kind of show in the world, and the idea of positive images, right? Because we're not always confronted with the most positive images in horror. I always want to think about like how they enact things. They kind of give us like plastic representations that do things to our bodies and make other things kind of possible. So I think I have a very similar starting point to Allison, as you can see from my slide. And in part, this work has come out of just a weird coincidence, which is that I went to Toronto to give a talk on David Cronenberg's Videodrome on the same day as the first big International Women's March. God, it was out already like in 2016, is that possible? It's 2017. And it was the first time that I'd ever thought about that film, which I love and teach all the time, as a film of feminist revolution. And I was thinking about it as a feminist revolution film for some of the same reasons that Allison was touching on around the work of Cronenberg, which is I was excited by the potential of something like this massive international feminist movement that's manifesting in so many different places in so many different ways, but also concerned about some of the limitations of the International Women's March, particularly around modes of exclusion that it was manifesting, modes of exclusion around trans women, women of color, et cetera, that always seem to kind of be built into these mainstream sort of white feminist movements. And so I was thinking about, well, does Cronenberg's film actually weirdly give me a different way to think about what feminist revolution could look like? Is long live the new flesh a kind of feminist slogan for a more inclusive model of feminism, basically? The uncertainty, so we're kind of in this weird golden bittersweet age of reproductive science fiction horror. So this is a line from the March. The Handmaid's Tale is not an instruction manual. I had to stop watching The Handmaid's Tale because I felt like I wasn't getting anything out of it in the second season. There's just nothing. And I also had to stop because the producers thought it was really cool to start marketing wine. That product made its way all the way to the shelves where they were marketing wine based on the characters in The Handmaid's Tale, and literally got pulled like as they were going up for distribution. So I can't really engage with that kind of bullshit, but I wasn't learning anything at all from it. Nonetheless, you can see in the way that, for instance, women are protesting dressed as handmaids. I also have ambivalent feelings about that. But you can see that we're living in kind of a fascinating moment of resurgent international activism around reproductive rights and technologies. For me, the most powerful manifestation of this is in Latin America with the Ni Una Menos movement, which I think has taken the discourse around abortion rights to totally new levels because they are explicitly linking it to questions of femicide or gender-based violence. So moving away from the kind of liberal discourse of choice or freedom, and instead very much linking it to kind of social problems, and also linking it through a feminist movement that is profoundly and radically inclusive in nature, even as it manifests through forms of separatist forms of organizing. And I can talk a little bit more about that later. When it comes to biotechnology, I think the uncertainty around biotechnologies as kind of speculative facts, so we kind of live in this age where like also fiction is increasingly seeming like an everyday possibility, is to provide kind of extremes of utopian and dystopian thinking. But when I think you put feminism into the mix, you end up somewhere else, or that's my kind of gamble on thinking through biotechnological horror through feminist thought, is that it comes back to a kind of weird pragmatics. So rather than the unlivability of like utopia or absolute dystopia, we come back again and again to questions of surviving and thriving. And I think I'd often put the question of survival within the context of horror films on screen, the context that we see on screen. It's always about surviving. So I don't know which of you organizers had the genius idea to run a self-defense workshop about surviving horror films. That was awesome. But I think the question of thriving is often the work that horror audiences do with representations that are partial or inadequate or just potentialized at best, which is again something I think Alison touched on so nicely in her talk. And I think it's that movement from survival to thriving that is also the site of a kind of feminist politics as well. So how can a feminist perspective help navigate this kind of unlivability and put it into a different kind of context? Biotechnological horror around reproduction combines both the diagnostic and the affective. So Ursula Le Guin, who's a kind of towering figure of feminist sci-fi, once defined science fiction as a thought experiment whose purpose was, quote, not to predict the future, but to describe the reality, the present world. Science fiction is not predictive, it's descriptive. And in its own way, I think horror is also descriptive, but often ambiguously so, suggestive rather than illustrative. It describes all those things that cannot comfortably be diagnosed or spoken of in this world without evoking terror, dread, inviting darkness, and punishment. But women, non-binary people, queers, and other marginalized types know all too well that the world is fucked up, horrible, dangerous, and exhausting. So how can horror help? In horror films that deal with technology, their subversive force is to throw into relief the kind of normative conditions of heterosexism, patriarchy, capitalism, that sustain the violent binary, the violent hierarchy of the gender binary as such. So to think through this, I'm going to map out a kind of preliminary terrain of biotechnological reproductive horror, working across a lot of different examples and sites of, I think this is Carnage, negotiation. And also ending by looking at one film that, for me, I've been putting a lot in dialogue with Videodrome, which is Lucille Hadlalovich's Evolution. Has anyone seen this film? Okay, I highly recommend it. I'll try not to spoil it for you. Next slide, please. So just to kind of contextualize maybe the more science factual side of things. So I'm mostly kind of thinking through reproductive technologies since the 1960s, and just to illustrate what some of these might be. So things like the invention of the birth control pill, which we date to 1960, assisted reproductive technologies. Often they're misdescribed as artificial reproductive technologies, but assisted is actually the right word. Such as in vitro fertilization or artificial insemination, genetic testing and gene editing, hot in the news now because of all the experimentations with the CRISPR babies in China, medical and chemical abortion, Obviously, abortion has always existed, but the kind of medicalization of abortion, and particularly the abortion pill, has created all kinds of interesting new terrain around thinking about how abortion can work. Also, new visual and diagnostic technologies like ultrasounds and sonograms, right? The kind of visual culture of reproductive technologies. And the popularization and commercialization of medical technologies for home use and surveillance. So this on the, I don't know what side that is, over there. When I was researching this talk and looking for horrific images of ultrasound, so this is a new trend where parents go online and they're like, my ultrasound looks like a demon or Satan or the mask from Scream, which I think is so much better than, say, a gender reveal party. I think it's a quite a nice kind of approach to thinking about the inherent horror of reproduction. But you can find a lot of examples of this, and I'm not quite sure what the point of posting it on YouTube is, but anyway, all of these technologies both respond to and reflect global problems with infertility. In particular, in the global north. Thanks. And maybe you guys, can you just hear me if I'm speaking?
Yes.
Okay. Particularly in the global north. For example, there's been like a 25% drop in the sperm count of American men from 1920 to 1970, largely due to environmental effects. So this kind of ecological crisis that's being manifested through reproduction, and a crisis of reproduction in particular. And also something like increased exposures to STDs because of the development of the birth control pill, which took the place of barrier methods of contraception, like condoms for the most part, until the AIDS crisis, and then has continued into the present moment. Most of these texts are kind of double-edged swords for women. Last week it was revealed, for example, that the original inventors of the birth control pill unnecessarily included a week of placebo pills where women would bleed out, basically, to induce bleeding, not because of any medical benefit or necessity for women, but because they were trying to get the Pope on board with understanding the birth control as a kind of mimicking a natural means of reproduction. So basically inducing unnecessarily bleeding, which is actually shown to have negative side effects for women on the pill, to try to please the Pope, who, I will remind you, will never use birth control and is at no risk of getting pregnant, as just a kind of example of the way that a technology that's supposedly about the liberation of women has actually been used to police and control women's bodies. You can also think about, if any of you saw the awesome film Good Manners that was programmed in this festival, there's a scene where the pregnant woman uses a kind of at-home sonogram to listen, or ultrasound machine to listen to for the fetal heartbeat. And that's part of this kind of massive culture of surveillance technology that's imposed on women's bodies, around women and uterus-bearing people's bodies around pregnancy. But studies have shown that those kind of devices actually create more anxiety than relieve anxiety, because who knows how to find a fetal heartbeat, right? It's hard enough for doctors and trained professionals to do that. You're at home with your shitty thing that you bought off eBay and you're like, where's the heartbeat? My baby is dead. So there's all these kind of problems around these technologies and their unreliability of use. Okay. So in regard to technology, horror is a place where the gender division of sexual suffering can be explored, where the normalization of female and non-normative embodiment in heterosexuality and reproduction are actually made palpable. Even misogynistic films generally get right the biases and violences of the medical profession towards women and non-gender normative people. In an essay called The Female Price of Male Pleasure, and I've somehow erased the author's name, it's Lila, I think it's Hoofdador, writes that on average, it takes a woman 9.28 years of suffering to be diagnosed with endometriosis, largely because of being dismissed by the medical profession, which is a condition caused by endometrial tissue growing outside the uterus. And by the time that 9.2 years go by, this is not just kind of sex, but everyday existence becomes a kind of life-deforming challenge. Those are her words. She notes that there are something like 446 articles on these extreme forms of female pain linked to sexual pleasure, compared to almost 2,000 articles in the medical journals on male erectile dysfunction. Next slide, please. So what's changed in the last, say, 50 odd years? There are sort of three main changes. And these images over here are all images from the birth of Louise Brown in 1978, the first IVF baby, which was a really interesting case study where leading up to the birth, there was massive hysteria in the press, like, is this going to be a Franken baby? Reporters were stalking the hospital so badly that they actually cut out the power at one point, and her mom was basically triaged to give birth by flashlight, because there was this kind of convergence, literally like in the Frankenstein movie, these reporters waiting to see what kind of monster was going to come out of this poor woman's womb, who turned out to be a perfectly normal baby who's now like 40 odd years old. And then it was like overnight that disappeared with this idea of the kind of new normalcy of this. And now there's been something like 6 million babies born through in vitro fertilization, which generally has not been shown to have many deleterious side effects. So three main changes. The first is the delinking of heterosexuality from reproduction. Obviously, queer sexuality was like not too worried about getting knocked up for a long time, but supposedly the birth control pill unlinks heterosexuality from reproduction, and there's a question of like, where does that kind of excess of sexual energy go? And this is something that feminists have thought about a lot, like how do you have sexual pleasure when you're always worried about getting pregnant? The second is the ability to reproduce outside of the limits of normative heterosexual reproduction, both the limits of the body and the limits of the heterosexual couple form. And this has opened the door to all forms of reproduction by queer people, making novel family configurations, single people, etc., etc. And lastly, the ability to control genetic traits through reproductive technology. Next slide, please. Okay, I'm just actually also going to just start my timer so I know where I'm at. This is a scene from David Lynch's The Elephant Man that I'm just going to play while I'm talking about this next thing. So just to think about some of the kind of scenes of horror that I'm going to be sort of mapping over the next little while. The first is this notion of kind of ectogenesis and feminist revolution. Ectogenesis refers to reproduction outside of the human body, or babies in bottles, so you might think of it. And I really want to focus on the question of labor here. So I think I'm going to overlap with a lot of the same terrain as Allison, but really taking a perspective on the work of reproduction and its relation to feminist revolution. The second is kind of new ecologies of horror, so the new kind of sites and spaces in which horror occurs. The idea of a kind of externalization of the womb, for example, and what that does, and how that's represented in horror films. The transbiological, which is a term that comes from the work of Sarah Franklin, but it's really been taken up by Jack Halberstam, a really interesting transmedia theorist, queer trans and feminist reproduction, and lastly, looking at the kind of evolution of feminist reproductive horror. Reproductive horror foregrounds questions of becoming, change, mutation, and reproductive technologies. And when technology of reproduction get aligned with genetic engineering, interesting things happen. And in the contemporary moment, we're having a big resurgence of interest in something called epigenetics. So if you remember high school biology class, there was like Darwin, where evolution happens between generations. And then Darwin's like dumb compatriot was Lamarck, right? So Lamarck believed that Lamarck was always presented to me in biology class as the guy who got it wrong, right? So Lamarck was the guy who was like, if a giraffe stretches its neck to reach up and get the leaves at the top of the tree, it will give birth to babies that have longer necks, right? The idea that the experience of the parent can be passed down to the next generation. Well, actually, in the contemporary moment, there's a huge resurgence of people saying, actually, maybe Lamarck was right, through the study of epigenetics, which looks at the effect of the fetal environment on babies. And so a lot of the studies around this is focused on stress and trauma. Holocaust survivors, for example, have been shown to sort of pass down trauma intergenerationally. Studies of 9/11, there's, I think, increasingly a sense that slavery, for example, is contributing to intergenerational trauma, which is passed down to the maternal environment. Now, you would think that this would give us all kinds of tools for thinking more ethically about how we might function as a society, but I have a feeling that epigenetics is just going to be used to police women, and particularly policed, marginalized groups like, say, poor women, women of color, who are already often coded as kind of bad mothers. Anyway, with the Elephant Man scene, it's kind of interesting because Lynch, who is a great thinker of biotechnological horror, often so coded through more vintage technologies like of the industrial age, kind of conflates this story in the origin story of the Elephant Man here, where the mother both like sees an elephant, is trampled. It's kind of a fantasy of vision directly impacting the fetus in the womb, which is the idea of epigenetics, but then confounded into the scene of industrial reproduction. A cloud that could be fantasy, it could be smoke from a machine, all of this kind of creating an ecology of reproduction that contributes to a body that's named freakish by society, but who is presented in the film as precisely not what's actually monstrous. Okay. Next slide, please. So these are just some of the questions that I've been thinking about as I've tried to think through the question of reproductive technology. So if reproduction is already a nightmare for many women, is technology the answer? Do we have a kind of utopian sense that technology could be a fix? Or does horror's dystopian take on utopic potential make everyday horror more visible and thus operable or changeable, right? So it doesn't just give us an image of the world, but also gives us ideas about what else we want, what else we might desire. Rather than the idea that technology is just going to fix it. And lastly, I have a question too about what is the horror genre's relation to reproductive justice. Reproductive justice is a concept that emerged in the 1990s through women of color feminism, who basically said that the kind of liberal discourse of choice, right, like my body, my choice, really wasn't adequate. And reproductive justice is premised on the idea of having both personal bodily autonomy, the right to have children, the right not to have children, and also the right to parent children in safe and sustainable communities. So you see it's a kind of more holistic version of reproduction that goes beyond kind of the act of conception, the act of giving birth, and tries to understand the entire life world or ecology around reproduction in a way that I find really, really interesting. And then it's linked to questions of justice for me is interesting for horror too, because I think horror is often a site where non-normative forms of justice can play out. So again, think about something like the rape revenge film, right? The idea that the courts that we have, the systems that we have, aren't actually adequate to speak to questions of justice when it comes to these kinds of questions. Next slide, please. Okay, so I want to start by looking at one technology that has really kind of made the link between the utopian and the dystopian in feminist thought, and that's the idea of ectogenesis, or babies in bottles, reproduction outside of the human womb. And I have this kind of, nice image of like the patriarchy with their like weird little baby who's a little bit backing off in the space, and also a couple of images down here of films and movie posters that speak to this this phenomenon. Ectogenesis is often understood in two ways. One is a kind of masculinist, patriarchal reappropriation of like the woman's inherent right to reproduce. It's horrific because it goes against nature. And again, you can think about some interpretations of Frankenstein, right? Like what makes Frankenstein so arrogant is that he wants to usurp the role of the feminine in reproduction. Or you can think of it as a site for potential feminist liberation, which I'm going to talk about in a second. These biological horrors confound the normative and the extraordinary. So a couple of examples from horror films, the film Progeny from 1999, which is pretty typical of the way that IVF and insemination are filtered through the horror genre. It's a film about like alien abduction, impregnation. A couple is like making love, and then all of a sudden like the man lifts off her body and kind of floats over here, and then she's lifted off and inseminated by aliens. And then there's a whole sort of reproductive horror about what that is, and in particular the conflicting desires of the man who finds it a particularly horrific possibility that his wife has been impregnated by aliens, and her desire to actually have the child, which actually ends in femicide. He ends up murdering his wife and going to jail. And one of the things that these films really make clear is that the trifecta of the kind of medical industrial complex, alien rape, and domestic violence converge in the dead bodies of women. It's an interesting film, but it definitely kind of is very familiar. If you ever watched like the X-Files in the 1990s, it feels very much like that kind of science fiction horror trope. The other two examples are examples of female scientists, kind of heirs to the legacy of Dr. Frankenstein. The Kindred from 1987, directed by Jeffrey Obro, involves a woman who's a scientist, and on her deathbed she confesses to her son that that he has a brother, and she's like, by the way, destroy all evidence of my work, and then she dies. And so he has to go to the house and go to the basement lab, where it turns out that there's been this kind of ectogenetic reproductive monster created, and he is tasked with the work of destroying it. So again, the kind of hubris and the bad motherhood of the woman who also wants to be a scientist and wants to experiment with pushing the boundaries of normative reproduction. Something that we see also in the film Splice. Splice, a Canadian horror starring Sarah Polley. And in this image here, Sarah Polley is part of a couple. So again, it's like about kind of working that sort of heterosexual dyad, a couple of like hipster scientists, basically, who again want to push the boundaries of reproduction by working with hybrids of human and animal DNA. And when their ambition is thwarted by the limits of normative scientific research, they take their work out of the lab into the home space, and they basically create this creature, Dren, who's a hybrid of, as it turns out, Sarah Polley's DNA, which she uses without telling her partner, and an animal. And here we get a kind of inversion of the baby in the bottle theme, where here it's the mother who's encased in a kind of protective gear, and the entire lab environment in some ways becomes a womb. And the whole film sort of tackles this question of reproductive technology gone astray, where everything becomes a kind of site of violence and reinvention and bodily morphing that ends in a particularly kind of gruesome and violent fate for both parents, and in particular for Sarah Polley. And I won't spoil it, but we can talk about the ending if you want later on. Next slide, please. So one of the reasons I want to talk about artificial wombs is because they play such an important role in the feminist imaginary of the 1970s socialist feminist Shulamith Firestone, who was kind of like disavowed by the feminist movement for a long time, and now there's a big renewed interest in her work since her death a few years ago. Firestone, in her 1975 book, The Dialectic of Sex, which you see here on the right. She wrote when she was 25, this kind of feverish manifesto for feminist revolution. 1970. She said that mechanized gestation would be fundamental to the abolition of gender hierarchy. And at the end of her manifesto, she writes a chapter on ecology. And she says that on the one hand, we're living in a moment of massive ecological crisis where like we've got to do something in order to survive. And on the other hand, she says, for the first time, technology is enough on our side that we could control our relationship to nature, we could control our neighbor relationship to the environment, and that this could actually be part of the seed of feminist revolution. So it's an ecological problem of the human relation to the natural environment. And in her manifesto, she says, the misuse of scientific developments is often confused with technology itself. So technology in itself, she generally thinks is inherently liberating, and it's its misuse that leads to these kinds of concerns. But she says one of those big concerns is that one of the ways that technological progress happens is often just in the service of normativity, something that we'll see a lot. Next slide, please. So in that book, when she gets to talking about pregnancy, she's like, we should just replace pregnancy and completely externalize all childbearing and all child rearing. So she says pregnancy is barbaric. Pregnancy is the temporary, like shitting a pumpkin. So she has like really graphic descriptions of pregnancy because she says there's no biological necessity for women to do the labor of childbirth. And in this, she echoes the work of other 70s feminists like Silvia Federici, for example, who basically diagnosed as reproductive labor all of the unwaged and unacknowledged labor that for her was really gendered in its division of reproducing the species, doing housework, doing care labor to kind of support the functioning society in ways that go totally unacknowledged. Federici is famous for starting the wages for housework movement, but that movement is often misunderstood as making a demand for like housework to be paid. And Federici was like, fuck no, like we ask for wages for housework to show how absurd it is so that we can totally undo this invisibilized labor that's attached mostly to bodies gendered female. And Firestone basically thinks the same kind of thing. Next slide, please. She sort of bluntly demolishes any romanticization of pregnancy and childbirth as natural and is really concerned to undo the naturalization of the link between reproduction and femininity. And she says, inequity is rooted in the fact that the entire burden of reproducing the species is placed on women, and that no stopgap measures, so things like paying for universal daycare, will ever be adequate to the problem. So she really goes into this kind of science fiction proposal where she says things like, you know, we've got all these new technologies that are emergent, span around the work she thinks is a positive thing. It's going to sort of jam the work of patriarchy to develop all of these new technologies, including things like an artificial placenta, which is her term for the artificial womb. So a feminist revolution for her includes outsourcing all of the biological labor of reproduction and childrearing to machines, but also to human collectives, envisioning a world where artificial wombs or placentas would release women from being held hostage to the reproduction of this species. So I want to think about that and kind of keep that in mind about thinking of the labor politics of reproduction here. Next slide, please. She also makes the point that it's often not really for women. So I have this little video that I'm going to show you, and I'm just going to kind of talk over it. With one of the first films at the festival, Nancy, Sarah said, you know, we're thinking kind of broadly about what counts as horror. And I think of this as like a mini horror film because I'm thinking so much about labor, right? So we get this kind of like really clean fantasy vision of what it would look like if you could just grow your baby in the corner of your home office. I think it's a really interesting, hilarious vision. Artificial wombs, as Firestone argued, would let people with uteruses reproduce the way that cis men do, without turning their bodies over as incubators. So what that would mean is, of course, there's no time off work for pregnancy-related complications. But as this video shows, like 40 years after Firestone was writing, is this a feminist fantasy of a kind of non-binary future? So who are the people in these videos? Are they lovers? Are they living together? Is this a kind of like 5-person, like new configuration of the family? Or are they just kind of co-workers sharing a space and sort of outsourcing the labor of reproduction? This is a real thing. It's called a biobag. It's already been tested. They've grown lambs in that were taken out of their mother's uterus midway through gestation, and they were successfully raised to a live birth and have not shown any kind of complications from the process. This is like such a clean, ridiculous vision of the artificial womb, but I find it kind of horrifying, partly because it suggests a future in which we're all just going to work all the time. In other words, the future of labor looks very much like reproduction. A reproducing body, a pregnant body, is working 24/7. And actually, and we've talked a lot about the feminization of labor in the contemporary moment, that's what work is going to be like in the future. You can work at home because you're working all the fucking time, right? So I see that as like a micro horror film. Okay, next slide, please. So what kind of work is reproduction? How do horror films about reproductive technologies obscure the actual work of reproduction that has disproportionately fallen on women of color, a site of real horror? Films about biotechnological horror and reproduction are overwhelmingly white, and they're overwhelmingly individual as well. So there's, I don't know of any films. I think Good Manners to me was interesting in that it's a film that really gestures towards the care work that women of color have often done to reproduce the species. But I don't know of any films, and I'd be interested to know of any films that, for example, look at the origins of gynecology in experiments on the bodies of enslaved women, experiments that were done without anesthetic and without consent as well. So I just don't know that kind of those kind of stories have been sort of told, and I'd be curious to know if anyone has suggestions suggestions for places where you see that kind of happening. I think often when it comes to women of color, the primary kind of affective tone in films is melancholy rather than horror. So it's something that we haven't yet been able to acknowledge or even thoroughly mourn. Okay, so the second question here is just a sort of quote rather. Dreams of artificial wombs may have been largely abandoned in the 1960s, but ever since the perfection of in vitro fertilization enabled a body to gestate an entirely foreign material, living humans have become the technology components of the euphemism assisted reproductive technologies. So basically people are themselves not just using technology, but becoming invisibilized as forms of technology as well. Next slide, please. So this often has also sparked dystopian fantasies. And you could also think about The Matrix as an interesting horror film, and I think increasingly it's also being, it was read at the time, but increasingly it's being sort of reread and re-acknowledged as a kind of foundational text of trans cinema. So I think it's interesting, not just because of the identity of Lily and Lana Wachowski, but also because of it being a film about transition, awakening, rebirth, and when Neo kind of first wakes up, the idea of Neo as a kind of neonate to the horror of the Matrix and the highly normative world that he's been living in to this point, he wakes up in this image of ectogenesis, these human bodies that are basically being treated like human materials grown in vats to serve as batteries for artificial intelligence. Okay, next slide, please. This is just, I'm obsessed with commercial egg donations publicity. Again, like one of the big debates that reproductive technologies evoke is the question of like, what's the difference between human beings and human materials? Which is, I think, that part of the kind of fragmentation that horror often evokes allows us to think through. But again, think about how labor is totally disguised here. Commercial surrogacy, which is a form, and this is not to make any judgment on people who might want to sell their eggs or sell their sperm, right? That's not where the judgment is. The judgment is, what kind of society are we living in where people are often forced into a position of economic precarity that, that this industry relies on, right? So in Canada, it's illegal to pay people for sperm, eggs, commercial surrogacy. And what that has just meant is that the market goes underground because really not that many people will do that for other people, except in alternative kinship formations. So why aren't we trying to cultivate alternative kinship formations instead of putting a price on everything? Again, thinking about like where labor is in the background here. Here we have like the happy hour egg donation, which is crazy. We have, I don't know, fishing somehow associated with egg donation. Here we have what looks like a kind of like bachelorette party around egg donation, all of which totally obscure the gendered labor that is super grueling on bodies to participate in modes of commercial surrogacy. Next slide, please. Likewise, we can think about this idea of the transbiological as also the work of being, the labor of being visible, so that pregnancy is also the performance of pregnancy, right? It's about surveillance cultures where suddenly if you're a pregnant body, everyone wants to touch your baby bump and your body becomes kind of public property, the kind of relentless surveillance of pregnant women and pregnant people in general in society. Here, I don't know if any of you guys remember Octomom, this kind of horrible moniker that was coined for a woman who, through the use of in vitro fertilization, ended up with 8 embryos in her womb, and her kind of extreme pregnancy, and extreme pregnancy is also a kind of weird cultural sport in the contemporary moment, was sort of avidly mapped by voracious media who animalized her. And so she's an interesting idea or interesting example of this phenomenon of the transbiological, which, as Jack Halberstam and Sarah Franklin have defined it, speaks to the kind of convergence of the human, the animal, and the machine. A convergence that for Halberstam is full of potential, but we can also see is very much used to dehumanizing ends in the case of the Octomom. And this is just an example of an ultrasound of a multiple pregnancy being used to sell Volkswagens. So again, it's like the roomiest vehicle that you have, right? So the womb is also like a car. It's this kind of conflation of the technological and the human. One thing about Suleiman's pregnancy, right, that doesn't really get talked about is the kind of permanent damage that her body has experienced as a result of this extreme pregnancy. So sciatica, she says, like, I haven't felt my left foot in like 10 years because the effects on her body were so extreme. Next slide, please. So So I think this is going to start playing automatically. This is a compilation of clips from the film Bride of Chucky. This is, of course, Jennifer Tilly voicing the doll who is then stalking her in the film. Bride of Chucky has been a really important film for Jack Halberstam to think through this notion of transbiology. This film is a kind of hybrid of horror. The second film to move out of the straight horror seriality, the first film to move out of the straight horror seriality of the Child's Play series, and explores the confounds of contemporary reproduction in this kind of ridiculously meta scenario. As Chuck and Tiffany want to move from being dolls, they want to grow up, right? They're dolls, they're never gonna, their bodies are never gonna change, and they want to kind of occupy the dolls of Jennifer Tilly and initially Redman, and then the scientist. And so they artificially inseminate Jennifer Tilly with a turkey baster in this kind of appeal to the queer and feminist technologies of the 1970s of DIY artificial reproduction. Literally. So what's interesting here is that the artificial reproductive technology of creating a pregnancy is also doubled in an excessive kind of way by parasitic forms of reproduction. And it kind of creates the suggestion that pregnancy itself is a sort of abnormal form of reproduction. It's a parasitic form of reproduction as well. The artificial insemination produces an abnormally accelerated pregnancy, which results in twins. And this is a kind of key paradigm of biological reproductive horror. So pregnancies are non-normative in terms of the speed with which they take hold in the body. They produce excessive effects. They produce babies that are too big. Space and time end up deranged. Scale and size are wrong. Here, dolls are adults. Paralleling again and kind of displacing where the question of reproduction and the changes it affects happens. As Tiffany and Chucky try to return to a normative embodiment, so this is like literally the next day, she wakes up. Again, we got this kind of confound of like the fat body, the pregnant body. It's not exactly clear what's going on here. So in this film, Chucky and Tiffany try to return to a kind of normative embodiment of sort of heterosexual coupledom, adult coupledom, but it's continually undercut and parodied in this kind of doll-sized heterosexual romance. Their failure for Jack Halberstam really signals a kind of queer and trans potential emergent in this film, where it's kind of enabled by and in dialogue with reproductive technologies. And I'm actually going to jump to the next slide, please. Other forms of objecthood are linked to what we might call extractive ecologies of reproduction, where bodies gendered female are like natural resources. So Mad Max Fury Road, I think, is an interesting example of this. And these are just two scenes of this kind of milk farm where this kind of world in ecological crisis, one of the things that it turns to is this kind of forcible extraction of milk, liquid nourishment, from bodies of women who are holding these kind of artificial dolls, and where female reproduction is basically a form of slavery. And here we see this kind of message left by the brides who escape and go on the run with Furiosa, we are not things, in their attempt to kind of imagine what alternative forms of kinship and survival might look like under ecological conditions of crisis. So the other side of objectification is a new form of labor that looks suspiciously like what Federici identified as socially reproductive labor: childcare, childbearing, sex, and housework. So reproductive technologies don't just result in objects, they actually result in labor being something that can be extracted from the body and objectified in that way too. Next slide, please. So how do we think about these future labors? And here we've got this image of 2001 and also an image of an ultrasound, fetal ultrasound from Alien 3. And 2001, where outer space also becomes a site of like perpetual labor. Being an astronaut is like being pregnant because you're working all the time. You're just working to stay alive in an ecology that's creating all of these changes on your body. The term cyborg actually comes from a proposition of a paper written by NASA, by scientists who were like, how would humans survive in outer space? Like, wouldn't it be just more practical if they didn't have to breathe? So we would just replace parts of their body that required them to breathe with, you know, machines, or we'd just give them prosthetics, et cetera, et cetera. Maybe they'd go crazy. So we always want to have like an injectable syringe of antipsychotic medicines handy that could just be injected remotely from like mission control. They were serious with all these kind of propositions. NASA took it up, and that's the origin of the term cyborg, which has become such an important figure of feminist potential through the work of Donna Haraway. Next slide, please. So Carol Stabile has a wonderful article called Shooting the Mother, looking at the history of fetal imaging. And from the 1960s, through the work of Leonard Nilsson, who's kind of like the guy who's exploring the fetal environment. And in this early kind of first images of the fetal environment, through macrophotography and other technologies, the fetus is always inseparable from the maternal environment. So you always see the placenta, you always see the womb, the language around it describes the fetus as a parasite who's basically parasiting off of the maternal environment. There's always a connection between the two. By the time we get to the 1990s, we end up with these kind of images in which the fetus is this kind of free-floating subject, and it speaks to the way that the fetus has acquired a kind of autonomy, becoming what Val Hartouni calls the kind of political subject par excellence, right? It's as if the fetus is just like out there living its best life on its own, totally unconnected from the woman's body. And you can see that in the kind of legislation around abortion, for example. So in Canada, the fetus has no viability or right to life outside of the maternal environment. And that's been one of the kind of stalwarts that has protected access to abortion in Canada in pretty significant ways. But this idea that the fetus is just this kind of subject that could be photographed as if it could exist outside of the maternal environment is a kind of visual side effect of the visual cultures of technologies that also rendered the fetal subject quite horrific. And in my research, like I haven't actually found that many what I would call kind of abortion revenge films. There are a number of films where like an aborted fetus comes back to take revenge in various ways, shapes, or form that survive the procedure, these kind of fantasies of the pro-life movement. But I haven't seen many films that, and abortion is really, it remains a taboo subject in a lot of visual culture, but like I'm waiting for the abortion revenge where like a woman is subjected to a transvaginal ultrasound and takes revenge on like the politicians and doctors who are controlling her body. And I kind of can't believe that's not a massive subgenre of feminist horror. I guess there's other fights that are slightly more urgent than just making films about it. Anyway, so these are kind of images that, again, speak to the kind of deranging of space and time that are characteristic of biotechnological horror. Next slide, please. All right, so we've seen this before, right? This kind of, the Alien series provides some of the kind of best documentation of the impact of biological horror. And in the original Alien film, everybody knows that the character of Ripley was gender blind, was written to be gender flexible, basically. And when Sigourney Weaver took that role, I think it's one example of a place where if we move outside of the paradigm of auteurism, we can also see that the role of the actress actually had a big impact on how we read the world of these characters and the kind of impacts of biotechnological horror on them. I think all outer space films are all about colonialism, obviously. They're all about extractive ecologies, and they're all about these kind of extremes of body modification linked to the environment. And so here we see, again, like this kind of visual staging of the birth scene, the violent holding down, the putting them in a kind of horizontal position, the struggle, the pain, and we're going to get a kind of non-normative birth of the alien baby in like an awesome scene, which again, which I'm sure you all know, none of the actors knew what was going to happen in this scene, so their reactions are all all ever so real. The whole Alien series, I think, is a kind of classic of feminist sci-fi, exploring speculative questions about the future in terms of networked bodies and also radical disturbances of the gender binary and the limits of bodily autonomy. An excess of reproduction troubles bodily norms, and it's a kind of icon of the intersections of sci-fi and horror in the idea that bodies are too much, they're too excessive, and especially for one person. So rather than a kind of normative mode of reproduction where there's a change, but then eventually there's a clear separation between the two, dramas of horrors of reproduction often suggest that clear distinction doesn't actually manifest. It's also likewise presenting a world where you're never not working. In space, astronauts are always on duty and their bodies are subject to new ecological pressures in forms of corporate and state control. Next slide, please. So this is made clear in a film that's often read as an Alien ripoff that kind of came out at the same time, Inseminoid. And so this poster, which is like obviously super exploitative, also is an image of a kind of gynecological horror where this is an astronaut. She's an astronaut just like those dudes, but they're sort of exploring the horrors of like what's coming out of her womb. So a bunch of astronauts go into outer space. When they're exploring, one of them gets killed. This woman gets abducted and is impregnated through artificial insemination with an alien baby. When she's remembering what's happened to her, though, she has a memory of also being injected with a contraceptive by one of her colleagues. And so it shows the kind of competing, the question is not to reproduce or not, it's all about kind of controlling the reproductive body. So that contraception and also artificial insemination are part and parcel of the same forms of violent, aggressive control, coded as sexual assault. When she is implanted with the alien babies, they make her extremely violent. They also make her super strong. And she turns on and starts killing all of her colleagues. Kind of understandable in the context of what's actually going on. So even though the film is really exploitative in the way that it shoots this kind of soft-core scene, although I think it also really shows how horrifying it is as well, it is an interesting way to kind of read a sort of feminist take on the labor of reproduction. Next slide, please. So in Aliens, the sequel, one thing happens that Halberstam says is really typical of what he calls transbiological horror, which is that all the kind of new radical potentials and possibilities, the disruptive force of reproduction, is so easily recaptured, renormalized, and reattached to normative forms of embodiment. So Ripley, this kind of kick-ass, like sort of non-binary, kind of gender ambiguous character who like is the survivor, becomes a mom in Aliens, right? So she's kind of like disaffected from the kind of, again, like gender neutral sort of space of the militarized environment in which she's living. So like they're all soldiers that she's traveling with, and they're all like constantly showering together like it's no big deal. But then Ripley is kind of like a bit of an outsider, but she becomes interpolated by the needs of this motherless child and ends up kind of taking her on and adopting her. It gets gendered, it's fun, but it's also like a bit predictable, and so she becomes this kind of working mother. Next slide, please. Right, so here she's confronting the alien queen. It's like woman against woman, re-individualizing Ripley. She becomes this kind of cyborg mother, and this big suit, this suit that she puts on, the labor of the working woman, it's kind of weird parody of like the power suits of the 1980s. Like Ripley's fully leaning in to the corporate environment in which she's living, but in this super normative kind of way. Next slide, please. Aliens 3 is about a kind of deprofessionalization of the labor of reproduction and also of the use of visual technologies. Here, Ripley is looking to see if she's been injured. And initially, she's really in control of the scenario. She can't see what's going on, but she's guiding this person who's like, I don't know how to use this tech. She's like, let me tell you how to do it. Let me tell you what to look for, la, 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 la. And then halfway through, he's like, shit, you have an alien inside of her. And at that point, Ripley really loses control. She's no longer in charge of the scenario. She can't really dictate what's to be done. She doesn't believe it as well. So again, it's about the way that visual technologies are extractive of autonomy. They displace the question of authority over one's body, the knowledge of one's body, to an external source. Right? And it's a scene of tremendous horror. Next slide, please. This one you might have to see if you can make it play. So Alien Resurrection skips ahead. So at the end of Alien 3, when Ripley realizes she's been infected with this alien, she rejects the role of virgin birth that she's being asked to participate in, and sacrifices herself in this kind of Christ-like figure into a vat of fire. And you're like, well, that's the end of that series. But no, 200 years later, scientists decide to clone Ripley, and in the hopes of producing a hybrid body that will allow them to extract the alien and thus weaponize it and monetize it. And here again, we have this image of ectogenesis, or the baby in the bottle, of this kind of, again, neutralized, desexed, infantilized Ripley, who then becomes this kind of sexually mature adult who successfully is able to hybridize and create a kind of distinction between herself and the alien, which is then extracted from her body for use by scientists. But in the process, Ripley becomes aware that there's been a series of cloned versions of herself, of which she's number 8 of failed clones, which visually present the hybridization as monstrous. And one of the things that the film tries to negotiate is the question of whether those bodies are monstrous, or whether it's the kind of biotechnological, sort of heteropatriarchal, capitalist, military-industrial complex that subtends and surrounds these bodies that's monstrous. And I think the film never quite resolves it. The film is always hesitating between kind of reading Ripley as in control of her own body, an autonomous subject with bodily integrity, and showing us the places where actually all bodies are in relation. All bodies are relational, and that any kind of notion of bodily autonomy has to understand that we're always in relation to an environment, that we're in relation to other bodies, and that there's sort of no way to think around that. Next slide, please. Again, these sort of images of, here she is encountering one of the failed clones, and again you see these kind of disfigured figures where it moves from the babies in bottles as a sign of futurity to this kind of preservative and spectacle of the body on display. Next slide. And here she encounters Ripley 7, who can speak, who's been kept alive in this kind of horrific and what seems like an extremely painful state. 7 begs Ripley, please kill me. Ripley kills her with tears in her eyes, and I think it's a really ambivalent scene. We're asked, what right does she have to act in this way? Is she killing herself? This is her clone. So how do we understand the relationship between ourselves and our cloned offspring, for example? These kind of confounds of identity are something that the film presents in a really interesting way. Next slide. Next slide. I'm not going to show this scene. Here we have this kind of abortion scene where it turns out that the seemingly visually perfect separation of Ripley and the alien is actually just encoded in a kind of invisible way, built into the DNA. And here we see Ripley with this hybrid baby that is the offspring of herself and the alien queen in this kind of scene of queer reproduction. But it's also dangerous. And so then Ripley kills it by using her own blood to create a tiny hole in the womb of the ship and then sucking the alien out through the hole. And this really reads to me like an image of abortion. And it's very much linked to the idea of kind of choice and bodily autonomy that the film has been negotiating as a whole. It's super horrific, sad even, violent. But Ripley gets over it pretty quickly. And at the end of the film, she decides to form a kind of new queer kinship unit with Winona Ryder's character, who is a kind of android. And again, you can kind of just see how this is happening, this kind of image of aspiration as a kind of visual coding of abortion. Next slide, please. And so, yeah, it's really gross. Next slide, please. And so here at the end, we have these sort of little baby alien gets sucked out, but then Winona Ryder and Sigourney Weaver's characters like go off into the future of this brave new world of repotentialized Earth. Next slide. And then just this last example from Prometheus, which again, I think this is the scene that apparently Ridley Scott really fought for, gave the film an R rating, which is the scene of a character who's infected with the alien who gives herself an abortion, if we even want to kind of call it that. But it was coded as abortion. It was very controversial, et cetera, et cetera. The only unit that can perform this is a unit that was built for a man. So it's another sort of indication of the way that the biotechnologies often are not designed for the bodies that they should actually be serving. It presents this as a highly traumatic and painful experience of extracting the fetus from the body. Well, I'm really running low on time. I'm just going to skip ahead here. If we can just skip ahead. Again, you can see like the sort of, this is just one last example of a kind of ecology of horror from the film Demon Seed, which kind of predicts the rise of things like Google Home and Alexa. So in Demon Seed, an artificial intelligence named Proteus basically takes over a household environment and decides that he wants to reproduce and become human. And so he uses a variety of artificial reproductive technologies to inseminate the wife of the scientist who created him. And it's a really horrific film where Julie Christie is trapped in her own home. Every aspect of the home's functioning is controlled by this artificial intelligence, who then inseminates her. Eventually she gives birth prematurely to a baby, which then gets basically taken into the body of the supercomputer as a kind of incubator, which is then rebirthed. And it looks at first like it's this rebirth of this kind of little robot, and it turns out that the robot is just an incubator designed to allow a human child who is a clone of the dead daughter of Julie Christie and her scientist husband to be kind of reborn. And so again, we get that kind of thing where you loop right back around to the nuclear reproductive heterosexual family unit, but here like really horrifically and with like a lot of uncertainty about how to proceed. Next slide. Next slide, please. This is just a 1901 film about incubators. So of course, incubators were a thing. They were just basically like a piece of luggage with a window carved into the top of it that was kept heated for premature babies, which ended up saving a lot of babies' lives. But those babies were actually displayed at Coney Island as freaks, essentially. It was also often white babies who were given access to this life-saving technology rather than babies of color who were actually at greater risk for premature birth. But this is, again, just an example of this film where this incubator is going to accelerate the process of reproduction, but things go awry, it gets too hot, and when the baby comes out, it's actually just too big, it happens too fast. And even in 1901, there was already a sense of like what happens when you engage with biotechnology. Everything goes wrong, everything goes crazy, and ta-da, the results are this kind of confound. Next slide. This is just an image of like the actual Coney Island site where they displayed these incubated babies as they were struggling to survive. Next slide. Next slide, please. So yeah, I don't know if I have time to talk about David Cronenberg. I have like 5 minutes. Maybe I'm just going to skip all the way ahead and just briefly talk about Evolution, because I think that's the most interesting film. So everyone knows, just maybe we can keep going. Yeah, David Cronenberg. I was also going to talk about Rabid. So excited for the sequel. I totally think he's a feminist, and I think a really interesting filmmaker of the body. And I think you can absolutely read him as a sort of, I guess, a transpositive filmmaker. Particularly because he's so interested in questions of the labor of reproduction and the work of reproduction, because there's so much sympathy towards bodies coded as monstrous, where the real monstrosity often gets displaced onto structures of control. So I'll just end by suggesting that you watch this awesome film by Lucille Hadlalovich, Evolution. Only her third feature film. I don't know why Gaspar Noé, her partner, keeps getting money to make films and she cannot get tons of money to make films, but that's it. Evolution is, I think, a really interesting film for the contemporary moment. It's set on an island that's occupied only by adult women and adolescent boys, or just pre-adolescent boys, where it becomes clear that the women are experimenting on the boys, and it becomes clear that the women are experimenting on the boys to try to get the boys to do the labor of reproduction. In other words, they try to create these kind of environments. Next slide, please. And Halalovich talked about how she just wanted to make a film about maternity and pregnancy, and she's like, why don't I just put it on boys' bodies? And talked about the fact that it's somehow more shocking when it's attached to boys' bodies, but also some things are sort of more permissible as well. So at this moment of kind of adolescent change, next slide. Just want to find this one clip. Keep going. Next slide. Next one. Yeah, so just again to kind of contextualize it, we had this scene where all of the women dressed in nurses' uniforms are watching a video of a cesarean. And it's not clear what their motivations exactly are. Are they watching it as an image of the barbarism that they're trying to escape through this form of separatism, this kind of extreme reinscribing of the gender binary by like literally going to an island, only having adolescent boys, and then basically using them as experimental subjects? Are they training to develop new forms of reproductive technology? It's really ambiguous. You look at their faces, they seem horrified, they also seem determined, and they seem like they feel authorized to use the boys of the body as these experimental sites. So if you could just skip ahead to 14 minutes and 30 seconds in this clip, just to kind of conclude. I just want to show you what happens to one of the boys who starts to become kind of curious and starts to think that something is amiss, that his mother might not be his mother, that she's not acting towards him with a kind of care. And he's subject to all these kinds of experiments. He becomes this kind of experimental subject. He's given ultrasounds. It's not quite clear what's going on. And reproduction becomes this kind of really elaborate and elaborated affair, where on the one hand, it seems like there's sort of fetuses growing inside. And there's been lots of experiments that suggest that cis male bodies could gestate pregnancies if they could just implant in this particular kind of patch in the abdomen. And of course, male pregnancy is completely real, with trans men having pregnancies all the time, right? So he then awakens, though, and he finds himself in this kind of, again, externalized environment, this artificial environment submerged in water, where, of course, he discovers that he's the fetuses have been sort of taken out of his body, reattached to his body, and he's basically being used as this kind of expanded host to reproduce. And it's not, again, clear why the women are doing this. There's another scene where they're kind of rolling around on the beach with these babies, kind of licking them in this kind of very awesome, witchy kind of scene. But it's not clear why they want to grow babies. Do they just need to reproduce their own population? Are they just keeping the girls? We don't really have a sense of what's going on. The film for me is really interesting around reproduction in the contemporary moment for a couple of reasons. One, because it shows the violence of the gender binary. It shows the violence of this separation. It shows the violence of reproduction in ways that I think speak back to what Shulamith Firestone was talking about. But it also shows, I think, the kind of dangers of reinscribing the gender binary in this kind of hard and fast way. So I think, like, in some ways, one of the things you could do is kind of read in some ways the gestures of the women as a kind of critique of TERFs, for example, right? Trans-exclusionary radical feminists, where there's this kind of extreme separation, this kind of contempt for and use of the mutable body, the mutable flesh, and a kind of failure to recognize certain forms of kinship. And I won't spoil the ending for you if you haven't seen the film, because I really recommend it. It's just a fantastic horror film. It's so creepy. There's almost no sound in it. The cinematography is extraordinarily Spartan. So it's maybe the most Spartan body horror film that I've ever seen, which I really, really like. But the ending of the film really kind of confounds analysis. It leaves us kind of hanging. And that to me is the work of speculative horror and speculative sci-fi. Where horror and science fiction come together is to take the kind of immediacy of sensation that we associate with horror and turn it into a speculative mode, to make sensation itself speculative. And so at the end, there's a kind of expulsion that we could see as a kind of rescue, we could see it as a kind of activation of a maternal instinct, or we could see it as another attempt to kind of control and contain the body. And I think both things are kind of are really unclear, and both environments that the film points to are equally unlivable. It's a really interesting kind of feminist politics, and one that I think really speaks to the contemporary moment where feminist politics and queer politics and trans politics are really coming together through these sites of body horror. Thank you. And I know there's films to get to, but if there's any questions, like, feel free to ask or come up to me afterwards. Mm-hmm.
I have one comment. Just in the first part of Alien, I would just like to bring back this motherhood as interspecies motherhood, because she actually treats Jonesy as an offspring that is not human, and I like this subversion.
Yeah. Yeah, the importance of cats in feminist biotechnological reproductive horror cannot be underestimated. But absolutely, and that's that transbiology, human, animal, and machine are all necessarily in relation to each other. So yeah, it's a great point.
Yeah, and I wanted to also mention, now that we talk about Alien again, Resurrection, although I don't think it's a good movie in itself, the whole topic about motherhood, about abortion and so on, I find this really, really fascinating that it's, as far to my knowledge at least, one of the few movies, or actually the only one that I watched where it's more ambiguous, because usually if you have a movie with forced pregnancy or demon pregnancy, whatever, anything that is abnormal in a certain way, which rape always is, you either have the acceptance as something of your own flesh and blood, or you have the rejection. And in this movie it's way more complex and it shows more of the reality, so I find this quite interesting, as we have this abortion scene that she actually regrets, but it's not the right thing for her to keep the baby. I don't know if I can, because it's so grown, but behaves like a baby. I don't know if I should call it a baby. But also I find the birth scene, which didn't show, so only is known for those who saw the movie, also very interesting, because this movie constantly shows motherhood and pregnancy as something violent. As the, for those who didn't watch it, as the alien baby actually kills its alien mother directly afterwards and rips apart the face. And this also rarely is shown, especially with the alien movies, as they usually lay eggs and don't go through human pregnancy.
Yeah, I think that's, for me, it's one of the things reading Shoot 'Em with Firestone, which is like pregnancy is barbaric, it's like shitting a pumpkin. It's one of the things, and again, that's not, obviously not everybody's experience, but I think it's one of the things that's often under-acknowledged, including things like the kind of pain, the kind of sexual violence that's attached to pregnancy. I was just reading an article that many pregnant women experience sexual assault during giving birth, which is so fucking mind-boggling. But what's interesting about that scene, the birth scene, is the kind of chief scientist is, he's in like a little cocoon on the wall. He's totally immobilized, but he's also trying to control the scene through narration. So he's narrating this as like this beautiful, wonderful scene, and then I think his head gets bit off at the end of it, which is, I really like.
The whole movie is showing how much male control about female reproduction, and also men trying to, with a certain type of reproduction, birth envy, basically how they try to find means of reproduction, and also basically keeping this control of women, because they themselves can't give birth in a traditional way. But yeah, I actually find this whole even now that I think of it, even more interesting, since I see a certain anxiety about being a mother in this sense, because there's always the moment of separation, and this you can also see in the alien queen being killed, as well as I also find the scene that you showed with Ripley right before she gets the wound in her hand. There's always a certain eroticism between mother and child, and this is also really interesting to see, because usually you don't have this if in a horror movie, especially the mother rejects the child. You always have this disgust constantly and the trying to kill it, but in this case it's fascinating how ambiguous it is and how much it represents actually certain images we have of mothers, actually what we see on the street every day of mothers cuddling their children in a really not abnormal way, because it is the normal thing, but in a really uncomfortable way.
Yeah, I think that again, that idea, and again, it's linked very much to sort of heterosexuality, but that idea that there was a sort of definitive break in the 20th century between sexuality and reproduction that made it not necessary to link those two in the context of heterosexuality. It sparks all these kind of crises around what's the nature of contact, what's the nature of love, what's the nature of eroticism, of sexuality and desire as well. And so these kind of places where there's a confound between a reproductive form of love or a familiar form of love and certain kinds of desire. And just a non-stop sort of thematic in all of these films.
Real quick, I'm just going to start handing around. First of all, thank you so much, Alanna, for this amazing talk. The discussion can continue, but I just wanted to begin handing this around. Recommended donation is between 4 and 8, and it's split evenly between the speakers and the space that is letting us use the space on donation-based.
Someone had a question?
What you said about the emotional value of reproduction is it's a manga series. It's called Battle Angel Alita, which is going to be made into an incredibly crappy movie this year. But there's it contains this model society which is hanging above the city that's the starting point, and later on in the series it's revealed that every single person in this model city is a product of mechanized incubation. This is all being controlled by a giant supercomputer which is regulating this entire city, and it's completely asexual. The society in general there is being held as like emotionally sanitized in a certain way, and the reproduction just happens to go through this. There's like genetical programming in the subjects, and like the babies are being handed off to just like randomly put together couples who raise these children. There's absolutely no emotion or sexuality involved in the whole concept of it. The whole thing is supposed to simulate long-term space travel, and it's a really interesting spin on this divorcing of reproduction off of emotional parts of the human nature.
What's so interesting is that what you described is kind of, on the one hand, Shulamith Firestone's vision, right? She's like, let's outsource reproduction to machines, but then let's raise all children collectively. So like, she looks at existing models like the kibbutz and stuff, but she's basically like, one of the biggest crimes is property ownership of children. So she also thinks of herself as someone who's working for the liberation of children. She says, you know, as soon as you have that parental claim on a child, that child is not free and it's not treated like an equal human being. So she says, let's cut that tie and have all children raised communally, and like, if they don't like it in one household, they can go to another household, trying to think about how children could have actual human rights, right? And what's so interesting is that in film and literature, that kind of distribution of reproduction often ends up being totally desexualized. It's often a reproduction of the same. Everybody's kind of the same, everybody's equal, everyone's like a little individual. But in Firestone, she thought that that was actually going to lead to a kind of sexual revolution for adults and children, basically. That she actually thought that the only way to have kind of sexual freedom was precisely to have this kind of cut of this sort of biological familiar forms of care, which for her were so damaging and restrictive. So it's interesting to think about whether there's any way to envision what the relationship would be between that cut of reproduction and then a proliferation of sexually different bodies. And I think that's one of the works that body horror does really effectively, is that it says that difference is desirable. Actually, I think when it's interestingly done, like in David Cronenberg, difference is desirable, and that it's not really just about this kind of endless reproduction of the same. So. Yeah. But I haven't seen many examples that would imagine a future where those forms of collective produce anything other than the kind of fantasy of like basically clones, multiple human clones. Would be interesting. Maybe Ursula Le Guin's work a little bit. Maybe Octavia Butler. Yeah. Thank you so much.